Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this Halloween, or Halloween if you are reading our title screen correctly. My name is Cassie Hopkins, and I'm the marketing strategist over here at Houseman Group, and I help coordinate the webinars for the year. We're so happy you could make it for this live. Just in case you have to jump out for any particular reason, this webinar is recorded, and everyone who is registered for the webinar will receive a link to the recording as well as a copy of the presentation slides. I'd also like to remind you of a few housekeeping things as well. So we are going to do a Q&A at the end of the webinar, but just in case you have a question, you can just pop it into the chat or the questions feature, and we will be able to see it, and our Arctic Wolf crew will be able to respond to you right away. So if you've got something that you just want some follow-up on, totally fine for you to enter that in as well. And then at the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey. We're really hoping you can fill that out, give us some good ideas for next year. It's crazy that we're already thinking into 2024, but we'd love to know what topics you're really interested in. So without further ado, let's get into our scary cyber stories, and I will have the Arctic Wolf crew take over from here.
Hi, everybody. I can go next. My name is Marlene Jones. I'm very similar to Cassie's role, just over on the Arctic Wolf side of the house. Today, I am thrilled to present to you David Cruz and William, aka Billy Cordio, sharing their scary cyber stories, both from an insurance perspective and an incident response perspective. I will let you two take it away.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you, Marlene. Thank you, Cassie. And thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. My name is David Cruz. I'm the Director of Insurance Alliances here at Arctic Wolf, formerly known as Tetra Defense. And even before that, I was formerly at Houseman, back when they were Houseman Johnson, before they were Houseman Group. So a lot of the names on here, I recognize a lot of the names, a lot of the companies. I was actually involved in placing some of your cyber insurance policies when you first purchased them years ago. So it's fun to see some of those names again here for all these great businesses in the Madison area here. So my role at Arctic Wolf is to essentially bridge the gap between our insurance partners like Houseman Group and all of the technical team members and technical services that we can deliver here. So I like to think that I'm a translator between the insurance and finance world and the security and risk world on our side. So it's a fun role to be, be part of. Billy, on the other hand, is as deep in the technical weeds as you can get. He's one of our best. Billy, what in the heck do you do here? And you're muted.
Thank you, David. So I'm William Cordio. Billy, call me that. That's fine. I'm an engagement manager here now at the incident response world. So now I'm leading engagements. Originally, I was part of the technical team, leading the restoration team, but definitely deep in the weeds, managing 10 to 30 cases at any one time, depending on how crazy the cyber industry is going.
Yeah, and it's been crazy lately, to say the least. The 2022, we saw a bit of a reprieve after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and things like in terms of ransomware attacks and network intrusion, but it's come back in full force, and we're seeing all-time highs in terms of those attacker activities right now. So Billy and the team are they're busy, to say the least. So today's agenda, before we get into the actual scary stories themselves, we're going to talk a little bit about what causes these stories from a technical perspective and what impact these stories can have in terms of financial repercussions for the organization. We want to set that table there so you understand that these aren't just things that happen in the ether. They're things that can happen to any company at any time. So we're going to focus on that. And then we're going to move into some stories related to a managed service provider, a technology company, the story about when a convention center got hit, a publisher, and then a commercial real estate firm as well. All of these are cases that we've worked internally here at Arctic Wolf. Over the past 3 to 4 years, we've worked somewhere between 2,500 to 3,000 ransomware cases. So we know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two as whatever insurance company, I forget who they are. They like to say that. We like to say that same thing. So we're going to share some of those stories with you in the hopes that you can avoid those more scary outcomes here. So when we look at what causes these particular attacks, we're going to focus on one type specifically, a network intrusion attack. And what that means is an external bad guy, an external attacker, threat actor is what we like to call them. A threat actor compromises your network and is able to root around inside that employee's computer or the entire network at large, lock files up and encrypt them, hold them for ransom, or steal data from the network, and then send you a ransom note to say, hey, I've stolen I've stolen all your data related to X, Y, and Z. Pay me $1 million if you want to get access to that back. These types of attacks typically are immediately felt by the company. There's typically a lot of operational impact because encrypting systems is going to be something that is going to bring operations to a standstill for a whole host of reasons, but it's going to be felt by the company pretty quickly. So we like to focus on those because the pain is it's very apparent when you're going through it. So when you hear about something like a ransomware attack, there's sort of a misguided notion that exists out there that these sorts of attacks are mainly caused by somebody clicking on a link or opening an infected email attachment, things like that. And while those can happen, they aren't the most common way that these sorts of attacks happen. If we look at the second quarter of this year, the most common way that those attacks happened was through some sort of external exposure issue. And we're going to get into what that exactly is. But what that means is that an employee didn't click on a link, an employee didn't open an attachment from an email, that the hackers just got in through an unlocked back door and were able to get into the network that way. So we'll get into what those exactly are. When we're investigating these types of cases, we typically find the cause of them 9 out of 10 times. So we've got a high degree of confidence in how these sorts of things happen. So if we look at the lion's share of how these attacks happen, what causes these scary stories, external exposure issues are the number one cause of these sorts of attacks. When we break that down, there's a couple sort of subcategories we can get at. Remote access hijacking is a huge one. So we all know remote work has become so much more popular since COVID-19 began in early 2020. Before that, most of us had sort of, fly-by-night sort of remote work systems. It wasn't a very common thing. Now that's more sophisticated in a lot of organizations, but those can be vulnerable pathways that attackers can focus on when they're trying to get access to a company. Compromised VPNs is the number one most common way that organizations are hit. Something called OpenRDP, that stands for Remote Desktop Protocol. The only thing you need to know about RDP is that it's the quickest, easiest, and cheapest way to give your employees remote access to the network. And Billy's smiling over there because that has been the bane of the IR team's existence for many years now. That one vector, that one attack method accounts for about 20% of all the cases we work. Historically, that was closer to 60%. If you were to ask us in 2020 or 2021, how many cases were caused by RDP, it would have been closer to 55 or 60% of all ransomware events. So that one problem is we've kind of taken the sharp edges off of it, but it's still pretty persistent. Billy, from your perspective, what do you think accounts for that drop in that one attack vector? If it used to be 60%, now it's closer to 20. Are we just getting better at finding it? Are we getting better at understanding that it's a problem? Why do you think that's gone down over the past few years?
I think it's definitely twofold. Like one of it is I think everyone for being moving back towards going into the office, right? So they're starting to close those holes, and I think it's becoming more common knowledge that it is discouraged, right? OpenRDP, just don't do it. It's a terrible aspect. It's super easy, and that's the problem. It's the convenience of it. But it's so easily hacked that I think just it's becoming more common knowledge not to do it or use it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think maybe a third factor there too is that most insurance companies, and this is probably how a lot of the folks on this call it might be aware of something like this. When you're applying for cyber insurance with Houseman as your broker, there's a very good likelihood, very high likelihood that your insurance carrier is going to scan your network looking for RDP as part of the underwriting process. So the insurance carriers themselves are aware that this is a major problem, and they're helping their clients identify RDP during the underwriting process, and may not even offer coverage to a client that has exposed RDP online. So exposed just means you can find it using a scanner. So the insurance industry probably has had some effect on pushing those numbers down as well. Now, does that mean that the hackers that were using that all of a sudden are good guys and they're going to go be cookers and bakers and candlestick makers? No, they're still going to be doing crimes. They're just going to find other ways to do it. But it is worth noting that one particular method does account for a pretty good majority of what we're working with. The other way that these scary stories are caused are often by a software exploit. So what that means is there's just some piece of software that needs a patch or needs an update, and a hacker is able to compromise that software because the update hasn't been applied. Most of us have smartphones here. We know every couple of weeks we get a notification on our phone saying that there's a new iOS version or a new Android operating system update that you need to apply. Every time you hit apply and you restart your phone, you've patched a phone. You've done that updating process. Your corporate software is no different. It's going to get updates. It's going to get patches. And you need to apply those on a regular basis because threat actors can leverage unpatched or unupdated software to gain access to the network. And what's encouraging when we look at this data, though, is that most of the vulnerabilities that are used in attacks, there's a small number of them. We've only seen about 18 vulnerabilities lead to all the ransomware attacks we've worked this year, and that's hundreds of attacks. So if you can wrap your arms around what those are, that's going to give you a good fighting chance at resisting some of these particular attacks right here. Good question here from Christopher related to patching. I'm guessing this might be one that you can probably more appropriately address than I, Billy. The question is, how much does monthly patching of Windows systems actually help reduce the ability of the malicious actors getting into our systems?
So in that term of keys, it's going to be dependent on what the software is getting patched, right? Windows systems themselves generally aren't open to vulnerabilities, but there are patches that get delivered through the Windows updates, right? Microsoft Exchange obviously is the biggest one I would think of. In terms of that would have reduced the ability to be hacked pretty huge, right? Microsoft Exchange had a huge vulnerability, and that vulnerability lived for almost a year and a half through, I think it was about 6 patches in total. So in that term, yes, that would have been huge, but it's generally it's the software themselves that need to be patched, not necessarily the Windows systems. Obviously, Windows systems are vulnerable to other vulnerabilities, but a lot of the times it's software that's getting exploited, not Windows themselves.
Good stuff, Billy. Thank you. So if we shift our focus to that minority of causes, but it's still it's not an insignificant minority, we'll say. It does happen that employees do click on phishing emails and links and attachments, and when they open that infected attachment, there's some sort of malware that's released in the system. That does happen. That can happen. And frankly, one of the scary stories we'll talk about in a few minutes was caused by exactly that. So it's worth paying a little bit of attention to. But rather than building your entire security program around the idea that an employee is going to get phished, looking at that external exposure issue is going to get you the most bang for your buck, you might say. But employees clicking on phishing links and emails does account for about 14% of all the ransomware cases that we see. So it's not nothing, to be sure, but it's a smaller portion of the pie. The next biggest category is historic compromise. What that means is that employees reuse passwords across different systems, and a compromise at one system leads to a compromise of another. I'll give you an example of what that means. Say that I want to order pizza for dinner tonight, and I go to the pizza shop in town called Dave's Pizza. Dave's Pizza requires that I enter in a username and password to order my pizza online. So I type in my username and my password, get my sausage and pepperoni delivered. I'm having a great time. Now, if I take the username and password that I used for Dave's Pizza and use that as my login for my work computer, I've essentially used the exact same credentials to log in for my pizza and my work. So if I'm a hacker and I compromise Dave's Pizza and I attack them and I get my password from Dave's Pizza, I'll be able to log into my work system because I used that same password at both organizations. So that type of leveraging of historic compromises from other companies is about 7% of the cases that we see there. The rest of them we'll leave sort of by the wayside here. But it's worth paying some attention to those too. So if we look now at what the financial impact of those are, because obviously that's what we're here to, because we're here with Houseman, because we're here with financial controllers and IT professionals, looking at what that cost is going to be very important too in determining what an appropriate limit should be, for example. So what we're seeing here are our median incident costs for these sorts of incidences here. So what we're looking at are just the technical incident response costs. So that is our cost to contain the threat actor and kick the bad guy out of the system, the cost to do the digital forensics investigation to determine the root cause of the incident, the scope and extent of the incident, what sort of data was accessed or wasn't accessed, our cost to negotiate ransom demands with the bad guys, and the cost for our system to help clients restore and recover their operations. So on average, that works out to about $44,000, $45,000 per case. And when you add in the actual median ransom demand by industry, that gives you a good picture of what the technical incident response cost is. Now, these are just median figures. That means that they are close to the middle, but we do have outlier cases where we see ransom demands that are well north of $5-6 million that even after they get negotiated pretty significantly, still might be a $600,000 or $700,000 or $800,000 ransom payment. So when we're setting insurance limits, definitely work with your team at Houseman to understand what those would be and what costs aren't included in this slide here as well. Things like your legal costs, things like business interruption expenses, extra expenses, things like that would not be factored into this figure here. Let all that inform what limit you ultimately set, but it at least gives you a starting point to understand what sort of cost you might be looking at should you go through one of these attacks right here. So with that, we're going to get into the actual stories now. So we're going to do these sort of podcast style. I'm going to read one of the stories, and then Billy and I are going to sort of debrief that story and see what kind of lessons we can learn from it. And then we'll tag team those as we go through here. So with that, we're going to get things moving here. So our first story is 2 is worse than 1. This is related to a technology company, a managed service provider. If you're not familiar with the term, a managed services provider is essentially just a third-party IT contractor. If you don't have your own internal IT employees or you need to augment your internal IT staff, you would work with a managed service provider to either purchase tooling from them or purchase services from them to make sure that your business has the IT strength it needs to actually operate, basically. So in this particular story, when faced with a debilitating ransomware attack, this technology company was left in a rough position. They had little visibility into their network. They didn't know if their backups were viable or able to work, and they faced immediate confusion and decision fatigue because they hadn't prepared a cyber incident response plan before the incident. To add insult to injury here, this client ended up suffering 2 cyber attacks within just 2 months of each other based on the above challenges here, both of which allowed the hackers to gain deep access to their corporate networks. So at the start of our investigation, we helped the technology company prioritize and coordinate their internal efforts with their carrier-appointed cyber privacy attorney and their cyber insurance partners like their carrier and their broker. Without an incident response plan and with limited IT resources, this firm needed the guidance that we could provide and that all those partners could provide to do even basic things like map out their network infrastructure and attempt restoration from their backups. The backups were really poorly organized, though, and no single person owned the backup process prior to that attack happening. And after examining those backups, we determined that the only way to actually restore operations at the company was unfortunately by paying the ransom and then decrypting all of the systems after that. Thanks, though, to our threat actor negotiation and restoration team, this firm was on the right track. Until, without warning, a second hacker burst into the network and attempted a second ransomware attack right as we were in the process of cleaning up the first one. So, like the cops who show up at the end of that scary movie, though, we were able to catch the new attacker within minutes of them attempting to compromise the network, and we kicked them out of the network before they could launch a second widespread ransomware attack. This is really a perfect example of how an incident response plan can help prevent missteps like this, and how organizations that know their network and test their backups and consider the possibilities that they might face before the attack often fare much better after the attack. Billy, I don't know how many cases you've worked for us. I don't know, hundreds, thousands of them. What is, from just a gut feeling perspective, what is the incident like when you're working with a company that has never thought about a cyber incident response plan versus one that clearly has a good plan, clearly has tested it, and sort of knows what to expect during an incident like that?
Yeah, it's definitely a lot more chaotic, right? There's a lot more discovery, a lot more just hands-on and hand-holding per se at the very front end of the case, right? We have to work really hard with a lot of IT guys to try to understand what their infrastructure looks like. We've had cases where IT guys didn't even know switches existed in their environment, right? And it's one of those hardware inventory systems that you definitely want. The other thing is a lot of people store network information, store lists of files, store lists of servers, etc. But then they get encrypted, right? So it's useless in terms of an IR plan because you can't access the data. So just making sure you have that secondary location for this plan is also pretty key here.
Yeah. One thing that this client did too is that before we actually arrived on the scene of the cybercrime, so to speak, they had attempted restoration from backups before we showed up. I can understand the understand the urge to do that. You know, when you discover the ransom note, oh, okay, we got to restore everything, reimage everything, get back up and running as quickly as possible. I get that IT is often judged on uptime and how often the network is accessible. Why might that not be a good idea, though, during a ransomware attack like this, to try and rebuild everything right away, you know, restore from backups without any consultation? Why might they not want to do that?
Yeah, data breach is a huge word in the industry right now, right? And so we oftentimes, I would guess, probably 95% of our cases at this point, there's often data exfiltration, and that's really the big part of the investigation, is trying to figure out what data got stolen out of the environment and what that data contained. With erasing of evidence, that forensic stomping, another term, you just lose evidence, right? And so it makes it a little harder to understand what got stolen out of the environment, which means your breach notification could skyrocket because you have to notify everyone instead of a subset of people. And then you lose the root cause can also disappear, right? We may not be able to identify how they got in, and so you still could have a glaring hole after you restore.
Sure.
Which we've seen, right? We've seen cases where the client's been restored because they restored before any forensic firm got involved, and then 2 days later they get re-hit because that hole is wide open still.
Yeah, that particular piece, I think, has gotten more important over the past year or two than maybe it even was a couple of years back, because a couple of years back there wasn't the amount of state level and, you know, sort of nationwide privacy regulations and legislation that existed was a little bit lower. So the potential third party liability pain that a company might feel from a class action lawsuit, or from an attorney general, or from some person imposing a financial cost on them because of their failure to protect sensitive data, that risk is greater now than it was a couple of years back even. So if you have erased the evidence of how the event happened and the scope and extent of the event, oftentimes you're in a position where you do have to notify potentially more people than were actually affected, and your liability expands because you don't have proof that the liability should be smaller than what you kind of have to assume that it is.
Definitely.
Yeah. All right. So that is that one. Billy, tell us about the convention center.
Absolutely. So this one, while we were preparing for one of their largest virtual and in-person conventions of the year, attended thousands of people attend this conference every year. The convention center operations were halted because they got hit with ransomware. Despite the financial support from their teammates and parent company, the convention, they only had 2 IT guys that worked to rectify the whole situation. The attack left them in need of restoration experts, ransom negotiators, and a full forensic team, once again, just to understand what the damage was, how do you recover from the damage, and what data was exfiltrated. To put it another way, they needed a full army, and all they had was a few medics. As soon as we were engaged, we immediately deployed our threat mediation and investigation teams. Our ransom negotiators began engaging with the bad guys. The convention center was, luckily in this type of case, they did have backups that were actually viable. That's a big thing here. You often don't see that. Once we had those backups and we were certified that they were viable, we started be able to restore quickly from them. We ensured the vulnerable servers could not be compromised. That's a big thing when you're recovering from backups, is you have to make sure they're brought on securely. So once they had those obviously they had great backup practices and solid operations here, but so we put them in a position to not have to make a payment. That's always a win in our book, right? We don't want to pay the bad guys, but we often do have to. Our negotiation team was able to protect their reputation, keep the name from the attacker, from shaming. So there's a lot of dark web shaming sites. David, do you want to talk about what those are?
Yeah. So that has to all to do with the concept of double extortion that ransomware threat actors like to deploy. So oftentimes they'll get access to your network and they'll encrypt your data. And encrypting is just putting a gargantuan password on a file that is essentially impossible to guess. So they lock up your data. And then what they also do is they steal that data from the network, so that even if you can restore from a backup, they threaten you with posting all that private data on the dark web so that it's all publicly accessible. So even if you restore from backups, their leverage against you, or what they perceive their leverage to be, is that, well, even if you restore from backups, we're still going to publish your data, so you got to pay to keep the data private that way. So that's sort of what the dark web shaming site concept is really all about, is, hey, we're going to post your data even if you restore from backups, so you got to pay us no matter what. At least that's their proposition. We don't advise paying just for the non-publication of data, but companies sometimes choose to do that based on their perceived degree of data sensitivity.
Yeah, absolutely. And then yeah, so thanks to these guys' proper backup practices, they were able to restore operations quickly. We remediated their vulnerable server, and then despite only being 2 people, we had confidence they would move forward with our recommendations of proper patching, enforcing MFA, and then enhanced security operations. And I'm pretty sure the event was a cybersecurity event when it happened, and the event went off without a hitch, I believe, as well.
Yeah, the irony there of the convention center hosting of the cybersecurity event getting hit with ransomware days before the event is not lost on any of us. So talk to me, Billy, about why backups might not work. If I've got cloud backups, or I've got a hardware backup, I'm really assuming as an executive that this is going to be something that will be sort of my get out of jail free card. And a good backup really can be that, or maybe not get out of jail free, get out of jail with less pain is maybe the best way to put it. But why might that not work? Why might a backup not be viable, Billy?
Multiple reasons. We often see the threat actor in environments for more than just a day, right? They're not just coming in and encrypting usually. Sometimes that does happen. A lot of times they're in there for 3-4 weeks at a time before they do these events. And during that time, they're trying to discover what the backups are, right? And once they have that discovery, usually what we'll see is they'll wipe the disk, so they'll delete everything. Sometimes we'll see them reformat the RAID. RAID configuration is just a bunch of disks put into one pool, basically. Secondary is they just encrypt them, right? They encrypt the backups. You can't use them if they're encrypted, just like all your other files. And so just backup practices is really what comes down to it, making sure they're not domain joined, making sure they're disconnected, making sure you have secondary copy in a different location. It really making sure you test them too. I mean, one thing we do see with backups often is they are a bottleneck. A lot of clients don't think about the fact that if I have to restore everything at once, how long is that going to take, right? Most backups, you're restoring 1 or 2 servers because something happened. You're not talking about serving 1,000 servers all at one time. And in terms of that, we've seen clients have to make decryption payments because it would just take too long to try to restore.
Yeah. That's one of the biggest misconceptions I've found over the past, I've been in cyber insurance and cybersecurity for the better part of the past decade. And there's sort of a persistent myth out there that, when they get hit with, or when a client or when a company gets hit with ransomware, it's sort of well, should I pay or should we not pay? And there's a lot of societal pressure. You should never pay them, and it should never ever do that. And I understand that, we don't want to pay these bad guys. We don't want to reinforce that bad behavior. But the truth is that businesses will, the decision about whether or not to pay the ransom is made before the attack happens, not after the attack happens. You have to, regarding a ransomware payment situation, you have to lie in the bed that you've made for yourself. So whatever options you want to have after the attack, if you want to have the option to not pay the ransom, you need to resource the capability to restore quickly and effectively in order to not pay that ransom. So if you haven't tested your disaster recovery plan to see how long does it actually take us to restore from backups, like Billy said, if you've got viable backups, but it takes you 2 weeks to actually restore from them, you functionally don't have backups because you probably don't want to withstand those 2 weeks of downtime, depending on, if you're a healthcare entity, for example, that's just unacceptable. Patient life and safety might be at risk. So you need to resource the capability that you want to have, and then test that capability on a regular basis to make sure that it works the way you think it's going to work. I'll tell you this, every executive that I've ever met during a scoping call, they'll go into that call thinking that they're going to be John Wayne and I've got a stiff backbone and I'm never going to pay the bad guy. And sure, some of you might not, But after a couple of days, after a week, after 2 weeks, because you haven't given yourself the ability to restore from some other method, a lot of times the folks that say they would never ever pay a ransom oftentimes end up doing that because the operational pain they're feeling is just a bit too much. So you don't want to be in that position. So you knowing that you're going to lie in the bed that you've made for yourself, make yourself a big comfy bed. Don't make yourself a cot, because that's going to be it's going to be tough when we're in the trenches together with you there. So any last backup tips, tricks, anything like that, Billy? Or I think we could probably have a whole webinar series on backup.
Oh, absolutely. Oh yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing to consider too is business interruption costs, right? A lot of clients don't think about that in terms when it comes to the backups. There's a big casino in the industry that was hit, and they paid day one because a $15 million payment meant nothing to their daily costs, right? So it's just a big consideration there as well.
Sure. One other question I want to tease out of this one before we move on to the next story. We were talking about the recommendations that this client put in place after the attack, and you used the term MFA, multi-factor authentication, which I think most of us on the call are probably familiar with, either from our own, personal accounts like our own online banking that might have MFA, or if the folks on the call have applied for cyber insurance, you certainly have come across MFA before, because that's basically table stakes for getting a cyber insurance policy these days. But you used the phrase enforced MFA. Why did you use that phrase? And are there other types of MFA that aren't enforced? Like, why did you say enforced MFA, Billy?
So enforced is more of a Microsoft term. If you're using Azure, they have two settings for MFA. One is enforced, one is enabled. Enabled means, yes, you can set it up, but it's not required. Enforced means you have to set it up and run it. Microsoft's one of the only company that has that setting where it's you can sometimes skirt around it, right?
Yeah.
A lot of other companies or a lot of other places, like if you enable MFA, it has to be enabled and it has to be enforced. Microsoft, like I said, is one of those ones that there is that weird option to enable it but not enforce it. And we actually have a case right now where the client had VPN set to enabled but not enforced, and lo and behold, there was 5 users that still didn't have it enabled, and that was where the root came into.
It always kind of works out that way. The thing that you forget about is the thing that gets hacked in a lot of cases. But that's a good point to make, because when you're filling out a cyber insurance application, it might not ask, it might just ask, do you have MFA on email and backups and cloud services and remote access? It might not say, do you have enforced MFA there? So it's just a point that's worth drawing out, because just because you have the MFA button turned on, if it's enabled MFA, you might not be receiving the security benefit that MFA provides if the employees aren't actually required to use multi-factor authentication. So when you're having the MFA conversation, if you're in a controller role or an SVP of finance role, talk to your IT team and say, hey, just so we're clear, is MFA enforced or is MFA enabled? And if they say enforced, it's worth saying, or if they say enabled, it's worth saying, hey, you know what, if it's doable, and it ought to be doable, we really would like that to be enforced, so that we can make sure we're complying with the terms of our cyber insurance application, whether or not they even ask, and really so you've got the risk reduction benefit of having multi-factor authentication in place. So again, we could do a whole webinar series on that. And hey, Cassie, we were talking about 2024 webinar ideas. Maybe we got a 9-month series on backups and MFA, but we'll see about that. Anywho, moving on to the next story here. So this is one about haunted printers from a publishing house. While discovering a ransom note on your network is universally a cause for alarm, imagine the fright that comes from having all the printers in your office go off at the exact same time early in the morning, printing that same threatening ransom message, so that every employee in every office is holding a copy of that ransom note in their hands. That's exactly what happened to this publishing house that we worked with. They received a note claiming that a threat actor had stolen a massive amount of data and held it for about a $600,000 ransom. This was a different kind of attack. They had stolen the data, but no files were encrypted, actually. So there wasn't any operational interruption here. It was just the threat of massive amounts of private data being leaked that was essentially hanging over the head of the publisher here. The publisher also had no idea if the attacker was actually still lurking in their network causing problems, and they didn't know what kind of data was stolen. And they while they were operating safely now, they didn't know if they would continually be able to do so because they didn't know if the bad guy was still hanging around inside their system here. So when we were engaged, we quickly determined what the root cause of the attack was. And in this case, it's kind of a wild story here. So the attack was a phishing email that leveraged the legitimate job posting website Indeed.com. We've probably seen their ads during like Packer games. It's a well-known job posting, job hunting website. In this instance, the attacker uploaded a phony resume that was infected with malware to Indeed.com. And then the HR director, believing that the email from Indeed.com must be safe, downloaded that malicious resume, and the malware began to execute on that system. This allowed the attacker to access the user's workstation and all the data kept on that workstation. And then to make matters worse, that system had far more access in the network than it should have had. This is something called local administrator privileges, and we'll get into what that means in just a little bit. For about 3.5 weeks, the attacker rummaged through the network, stealing data before deploying their printed ransom notes early that morning. Thanks to our previous experience with this threat actor, though, but also with this particular Indeed tactic, which we've seen before in other cases, our forensics and our threat intelligence team were able to deploy a threat detection tool called an EDR, short for Endpoint Detection and Response. We'll get to what that is in a bit too, if you're not familiar. What that gave us was the ability to have full visibility to the network, which enabled us to kick the bad guys out, safely rebuild the impacted systems now that the bad guy was out of here, and conduct the rest of the investigation without fear of the attackers interrupting the publishing house again. So in this case, we were able to completely thwart the ransom payment since no encryption had occurred, and we gave the client peace of mind after we eradicated the threat and were able to show them what data was or was not accessed. We're frankly always happy with a positive outcome like this. We don't want, again, it's never a good thing for a client to pay a ransom, but there are instances where that might be the only viable path to continuing the company, basically. This nightmare really could have been completely avoided, though, with proper endpoint detection and response software in place, good network monitoring, good employee training, and implementing something called the principle of least privilege to keep admin accounts better protected. So, Billy, there's 2 points that I want to dig into here. The privilege came up a couple of times here, meaning that the workstation that got compromised had local admin privileges, and one of our recommendations was implementing the principle of least privilege. In the security world, what does privilege mean, and what does the principle of least privilege mean, Billy?
So easiest way to concept it would be like almost like keys to the castle, right? If you have local administrator, you have complete control of that endpoint. And so least privileges means someone has to walk there with like a key to help you unlock it, get what you need done, and then take that key away. And so obviously we don't want anyone to use a key every day, only privilege entries, right? So you don't want everyone to have administrator access. You don't want even your IT guys to have administrator access every day. Generally what we recommend is separating those accounts, just because 90% of your daily function you can use a regular user and you don't need that escalation.
Yeah. You know, it's an interesting dynamic that sometimes comes into play here. We've worked cases where a company gets compromised because an executive level, like a CEO, CFO, COO type they were the attack, or their work system was the attack vector that allowed the threat actor to get in. And in those instances, it's an interesting dynamic, because in those cases, the executives are saying, well, I'm the CEO of the company, I should have administrator rights because I administer the company, which is it's a different like organizational administration is not technical administration or IT administration. They're two separate concepts. But we've had instances where sort of like the pride of that particular executive is what caused the downfall of the company, because they thought, well, I'm the CEO, I administer things, I should be an administrator on my own computer. You really shouldn't. It's a completely separate concept, organizational versus technical administration. Another way to think about this, and keeping the principle of least privilege in mind, say that you've got a sales employee. That sales employee should have access to all of the systems that a sales employee needs to do the job of sales. They shouldn't have access to your accounting systems because they're not in accounting. They shouldn't have access to the HR files because they're not in human resources. They should have access to just the data and systems they need to do their job. And if that's the case, then they have the least privilege necessary to do their job well. What happens is that there's something called privilege creep that can happen, where over time somebody's privilege gets expanded into this area and this area and this area. And if that employee is the one that falls victim to an attack, the hacker is going to have whatever data that employee has access to. So if over time they've gotten access to all of these systems and all this data, then the hacker is going to have access to all that same information as well there. So keeping privilege under control is one of those controls that really can limit the scope and extent of a data breach, because only the information that an employee has access to will be at risk, instead of all of the company information if they were, say, an administrator on their own computer or on the company network. One other point that came up here, and it hasn't come up yet, is the idea of EDR software. That stands for Endpoint Detection and Response. If you've seen MFA show up on cyber insurance applications, you're probably starting to see EDR show up on cyber insurance applications as well. In this particular instance, EDR is sort of an evolution from something called an antivirus tool. That's probably a term that most of you are familiar with. You probably have it on your home computers, and that type of software has been around for 20, 25 years at this point. So most of us have interacted with it and kind of understand the concept that antivirus is really all about, blocking malicious files on your computer and, isolating them and deleting them before they cause problems. That's sort of the layman's understanding of what antivirus is. EDR is really the next generation, next version of that. The example that I like to use is this. Imagine we're standing in a police precinct, and we've got one wall over here that has the top 10 most wanted criminals in our precinct here. And two detectives walk through the door. One detective is antivirus, one detective is EDR. What the antivirus detective is going to do is look at those 10 wanted posters and memorize the names and the faces of those criminals and go out and arrest only those criminals that match the names and the faces on the wall. That's good. We want the bad guys off the street. We want the bad software off the street as well. What the EDR detective is going to do is look at the names and faces on the wall, but they're also going to read the descriptions of the crimes they committed and then go out and arrest anybody that matches the name and the face, but also anybody that's committing the types of crimes that those people on the wall have committed. So what that means is that second detective, that EDR detective, is going to be identifying more threats to the community or more threats to the computer than the other detective will here. Billy, is that just a gross oversimplification of it? Or does that kind of hit at the, we're not looking for just bad faces, we're also looking for bad activities as well, which is kind of the heart of EDR here.
Yeah, definitely. AV is more of like a dictionary lookup, right? They're looking at files according to their dictionary and seeing if they find matches, whereas EDR is definitely that AI related, trying to process and see things that are bad currently happening and can they relate them to anything else they're seeing.
Yeah, if you want to say you've got an AI-powered security program, which kind of sounds fun to say, you can EDR, let's just say that. But so we had talked earlier about enforced versus enabled MFA. There's sort of a similar dichotomy in place regarding EDR systems that are in detect-only mode versus protect mode. What that means is that if you've got this really powerful tool that can identify bad software and bad activities on your network, that EDR tool can be set to just detect those threats, but not actually autonomously stop those threats, which is, there can be value in that. But if it's set to protect mode, it will actually then take that secondary step of isolating and stopping those threats before they become a problem on the rest of the network there. So again, that's an issue of just having the software isn't necessarily the silver bullet. It's the software configured appropriately so that it can actually stop those things. And really not assuming that anything in security, let alone an EDR tool, none of this is a set it and forget it type proposition. Having somebody that's responsible for monitoring those alerts, regardless of what mode the tool is in, is really key to making sure that you're getting the most security value from that tool as you possibly can. So we've got one more here, a commercial real estate company here, and that is not always a target that you might think of as a cyber attack, but as we go through here, I think it'll be pretty clear how they might have fallen victim here. So take it away, Billy.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm the CFO at a commercial real estate firm. Discovered they were locked out of their bank account, right? Scary thing in any world, not just a CFO. So frightening scenario. They were able to contact a coworker whose access to the account was still working. As the CFO got into the account, they realized it was swapped for an unknown email address. Their password was changed, and MFA tokens were required now on the account as well. Shortly after, though, the CFO noticed their email also wasn't working, only to find out later that 2 wire transfers ended up happening during this period. We need to kick the threat actor out of these key accounts, lock down their access, and then hopefully attempt to recover over $100,000 that was initiated in those wire transfers. During our investigation, we uncovered unauthorized logins to the email via a remote working tool. Despite the organization had no formal remote access in this place. This means that the threat actor installed their own remote access tool after they hacked into this CFO's machine. If they had an ER monitoring tool in place, generally this activity would be flagged as unauthorized, and you would see an alert, and automatically interrupted is often happening as well. So once inside, though, the threat actor was able to leverage a useful but dangerous Excel file. Don't keep your username and passwords in Excel documents, right? We see it all the time. It's not best practices, obviously. So they found a document with username and passwords of accounts from the CFO, allowed them to get into email, got into the banking account. In this case, we didn't see a wide malware infection or break down the operations at all. It was just a devastating financial impact that led from an email compromise. These attacks are often quick. They are hard to detect, and they can lead to large financial losses pretty quickly. But based on our investigation, we were able to prove to the bank that these were not initiated by authorized parties. This one actually has an happy ending. We don't often get this happy ending, but by being able to provide the information to the bank was actually able to reverse the wire transfer in this case. Be warned, though, like I said, this is a very exceptional, rare outcome. We don't see that happen often. Sometimes it's because the wire transfer isn't seen for a week, and so obviously take some steps into making sure that wire transfer is secure. Assume that every wire transfer you send is gone forever, right? David, I think you have a background in wire transfers. You can probably comment on.
Yeah, actually, but before I worked at Houseman in the early part of the 2010s, I was a banker. And when you're going through banker training, you get taught how to properly send wire transfers. And the first thing they said is, assume the moment you hit send, assume that money is gone forever and never coming back. That's just kind of how the global SWIFT wire transfer system works, especially if we're talking about an international wire transfer. There's maybe a little bit more flexibility for going between US banks, but if it's going overseas, once it's gone, you have to assume it's gone. So this is a pretty rare situation where we were able to get the bank to reverse that transfer, but it was because the client identified it very quickly, and we could prove very quickly that it was an unauthorized transfer. I'd say in 99 out of 100 cases, this is not what happens, though. So this is an instance where when we're talking about different security controls that prevent financial losses, not every control is a tool that costs money. Some controls are processes that you put in place that are really a no-cost proposition that can have a major impact. So having like two two signatures on any wire transfer over, you pick the threshold, maybe $5,000, $25,000, whatever's appropriate for your industry and your operation. Having a process like that in place can prevent something like this from happening. Maybe not in this particular instance because the hacker compromised the company email, but we see loads of situations where a company receives a fake invoice that has a new bank account routing number input onto the invoice, and nobody thinks to check that new account number before they pay that invoice, and then the money's gone that way. So having sort of a two-step verification process in place can really prevent a lot of these financial fraud types of attacks there. Absolutely. So in this particular instance, we talked about enforced MFA, Billy, and we also talked about, we haven't talked about yet. we've talked about enforced MFA, but MFA can have a couple of different forms. You can get your 6-digit code via an app on your phone. You can get it via text message or an email. Is one of those methods a preferred method over the other? None of them cost anything, but there's different processes in place. What would you recommend companies do, and really people do in our own personal lives, when it comes to enabling or enforcing MFA?
As weird as it sounds, text messaging is very reliable. We don't generally want to recommend people doing it through email, right? Because oftentimes, if you have a compromised account, they're probably going to have that email password, right? And so we don't really want to rely on email for that MFA code. Text messaging is, like I said, it's old reliable. It's one of those things that's super hard to hack into. And don't get me wrong, there are SIM swaps where that does happen, but that's very, very rare. Text messaging, I mean, obviously there's a lot of authenticator apps, Google Authenticator, Microsoft has one, Okta, a lot of the providers have their own. Those are generally some of the more secure methods. Usually those two, but like I said, never really rely on email though for MFA is what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's probably a line to be drawn when it comes to a text message MFA token being hacked, so to speak. That's not something that it's going to happen to most companies. That it's sort of, if you're a very notable defense contractor, maybe then you might be more targeted, as opposed to just being a commercial real estate firm that has office space. You're probably not a direct target in most instances, but if you think you might have a specific target on your back because maybe you're a politically active organization, maybe you are a defense contractor, maybe you deal in nuclear waste, who knows? If there's something like that makes you perhaps a more sensitive target, then it's worth looking at something like the app-based MFA, because it is slightly more secure than the text message. But if you don't have that specific target on your back, it like Billy said, the text-based MFA is a reasonable and appropriate security measure for most companies out there, frankly, here. So that is a wrap on our scary stories. Hopefully they weren't too scary. Hopefully we can sort of see the path out in some of these instances here. Ultimately, when we look at, the causes of a lot of these, what I like to say is that companies aren't falling victim to cyber attack because they're missing PhD level cybersecurity. They're missing about 5th grade level cybersecurity, and it takes some effort to even get to that point. But this is a problem that can be solved. This isn't an impossible thing right here. One of the things that we do with our partners at Houseman Group to help you get those basic fundamentals in place is giving you access to the Cyber Jumpstart program that we've got here at Arctic Wolf. This is a tool that can help you build an incident response plan. It helps you do some scanning of your network to identify whether or not you have one of the most common vulnerabilities that lead to ransomware attacks. And it can help you get started on some different security projects. This is something that's available at no cost because you're a Houseman client. So if you follow that link, that is going to get dropped in the chat here soon, or sent in the follow-up email. I forget how we're getting that to you. But reach out to your advisor at Houseman, your commercial client executive. They can help get you that right link so that you can get your security journey started right here. We do have a few minutes left for questions if anybody's got any. I know we had a couple come through in the chat as we were talking right here, but if there's anybody else that has a burning question related to these scary stories or just security more generally, Billy and I are here to answer them.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. And that just got dropped in the chat, so you should be able to see that if you are looking at the chat feature on Zoom. We did have a couple questions come through. I don't know if you feel like you've answered them fully, so I'm just going to reiterate them and just see if you feel like that's something we can address again. So how much does monthly patching of Windows systems actually help reduce the ability of the malicious actors to get into our systems?
Once again, it does and it doesn't, right? A lot of the vulnerabilities are more external ones, and they're through software. Obviously, patching your Windows can do some Microsoft programs that are very prominent in the industry with CVEs as well. But so it's never a bad thing, right? The more patches, the better.
Yeah, more patches, the better. And the types of systems that are often leveraged in these attacks, like Billy said, they might not be a Windows system. It might be your VPN provider, your file transfer system provider. So they're tools that run on a Windows system, but they're not Windows tools. So if you want to keep those up to date, you need to work with that particular interface or that particular tool to apply the patch. You wouldn't do it through the Windows system, if that makes sense.
Totally.
Yeah.
Wait a couple more seconds. I'm just gonna shamelessly plug, because as someone who does not understand cyber awareness, this was super informative for me personally. And I know that
Good.
even though in these case studies we're talking about particular industries, maybe you're a company where you're not worried about, you know, a giant event and somebody hacking into all those emails. But what's really cool about Cyber Jumpstart is it is really tailored to like your knowledge and your preventative care in the cyber realm. So we actually did it here at Houseman, and it was really enlightening and really educational. So I definitely encourage you, if you're a client of ours, reach out to your agent. They are aware of how to get in touch with Arctic Wolf and see if there's something they can do on your end to kind of make something happen. So
Yeah, just kind of to piggyback off that, the size of your business is very irrelevant. They hit mom and pop shops, they hit Fortune 500 companies. They don't care who it is. If they have a way in the environment, they will take advantage.
Yeah, that's one of the misconceptions we see in cyber a lot is that people think, oh, well, I'm just a tool and die shop in Viroqua. I'm just a dairy processing plant in Portage, or those are just two I made up. But I'm just a so and so. Nobody's looking for me. And the truth is, you're right. Nobody is looking for you. Nobody's opening up the yellow pages and saying, I'm going after that dairy cooperative in Monroe. That's not how threat actors find targets. What they do is they scan entire segments of the internet, looking for systems, looking for software programs that they know how to exploit. They'll exploit those programs, and oftentimes they've only found out who they've hacked after they've hacked them. So I think of them like a prairie dog. Like, they pop their head out of the hole and go, oh, I'm inside a dairy cooperative. Oh, I'm inside Equifax. Like, they don't know who they've hacked until after they've hacked them. So you're right. Nobody might be looking for you, but that's probably not going to save you from an attack, because they're looking for your software vulnerabilities. They're not looking for your company, if that makes sense. So you got to sort of shift how you think about. If you look at your own company from an attacker's eyes, that helps you figure out, okay, how might they try to get in, and how might they find me, so to speak. And if you can give yourself a little bit of camouflage by patching those software programs, that's going to help you remain a bit more invisible, so to speak, from an attacker.
Seems like cyber attacks are kind of the great equalizer in a way.
Regrettably so, Cassie.
Yeah. Well, no other questions came in. If you guys think of something after the webinar, we are going to send out an email with David and Billy's information in it as well. So you're welcome to reach out to them. Thanks so much for joining us today. We hope you learned something. We hope it was informative, and at least a little spooky. That was our goal. So have a great rest of your day. And again, if you could just fill out that survey at the end of the webinar, that would be really helpful for us. So thanks again.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.